where mental health meets real life. I'm your host, Samantha Ariza, a therapist, an educator, and a semi-normal human being. But overall, your go-to for real, relatable conversations about healing, growth, and emotional wellness. Around here, we believe mental health doesn't have to be stiff or scary. We keep it human, practical, and have a little bit of fun along the way because, hey, life's messy and we're all just trying to figure it out. Each week, you'll get honest insights, science backed tools, and stories that remind you you're not alone in this. Whether you're on your own healing journey or supporting someone else, there's something here for you. So take a look around. Let's take a breath, grab a cup of coffee, and get a little comfy. Let's dive in. Today, we're tackling a very provocative hot take, and I like that word provocative. Diagnoses do more harm than good. They box people in. And I get why some people feel that way. Labels can feel limiting, reductive, and very permanent. But the other side of that conversation often gets lost. The way that diagnoses help people get care, access to resources, and make sense of what's happening internally. So let's walk through this tension together. We're going to discuss what research says about the benefits and risks of diagnostic labels, the pushback against just lifestyle changes claims, as well as examine how medication is a crutch and that narrative, and how that misses the nuance of everything. So let's get into it. First, let's talk about the promises and perils of labels. Because what a diagnosis can do for you and what labels can do to help people are this: they name the experience. Because when struggles feel vague or overwhelming, having a name can reduce that confusion and self-blame. It also gives access to treatment accommodations and access to insurance payments because many systems require a diagnosis for therapy, insurance coverage, or even accommodations at school and in the workplace. I know that I can't submit claims to insurance without a diagnosis attached. It also gives us kind of a shared language, whether with professionals or others, like mental health providers, support groups, and researchers often work with diagnostic frameworks. We see in a scoping review titled Consequences of a Diagnostic Label, which was a systematic scoping review. This was published about 3 or 4 years ago. It mapped out 5 different domains of consequences after a mental health label is applied. Some are positive and some negative. The first domain mentioned in the article is psychosocial impact. And starting here is super important because this is where the emotional weight often hits first. When someone receives a diagnosis, it can change how they see themselves and how they believe others will see them. This domain includes emotional relief or distress, shifts in someone's self-identity, social stigma, or even validation. Some people describe diagnosis as finally getting a name for the monster, and it made them feel like they weren't crazy or even lazy. They were living with undiagnosed ADHD or depression, anxiety, trauma, autism. And this one quote from the review put it beautifully. It was like getting a map. It didn't solve everything, but it gave me somewhere to start. But for others, the label became the monster. One participant said, after the diagnosis, I just wasn't me anymore. I was a diagnosis to everyone around me. Some people began to internalize shame or feel that they had to perform their illness to be believed. And this is where language matters because when we say someone is bipolar instead of lives with bipolar disorder, we start to blur their identity with the diagnosis. And that is where boxing in begins. The next domain the article talked about is support. And this domain is about how diagnosis impacts relationships with family, friends, teachers, employers, and even clinicians. For some, it was a breakthrough. My parents finally took my anxiety seriously once it was on paper. Or my therapist knew exactly how to support me after my autism diagnosis. But others experience a support collapse. They saw friends pull away, bosses starting to treat them like they were fragile or incapable, or even loved ones becoming overprotective or patronizing. That talking down and belittling that sometimes people feel. The review summed it up this way: diagnosis altered the direction and quality of support, sometimes increasing empathy, sometimes eroding perceived competence. So we have to ask, are the people in our lives able to support us, or only the version of us they're comfortable with? Another big domain mentioned is future planning. And this one kind of hit me hard because this is the way that a diagnosis reshapes how people think about their future. Because sometimes it brings clarity. Now I understand how my brain works, and I can actually plan my career around what energizes me. Someone else said, I finally knew what I needed to ask for in relationships and work. But others described feeling suddenly small. I used to dream big. Now I don't know if I'll ever be independent. And someone else said, it felt like my future got rewritten without my permission. In the researchers' words, diagnosis shaped how individuals imagined and prepared for their future, both as a catalyst for agency and a source of existential doubt. Some people made empowered changes, while others froze. And not because they're weak, it's because big labels carry big implications. Next is behavior. This domain looks at how diagnosis changes what people do. For some, it sparked positive action. They went to therapy, they started medication, they set boundaries, they advocated for accommodations, which is what all therapists want for their clients to do. But some others reported more avoidant behaviors. They withdrew from work or relationships. They avoided risk taking altogether. They defined everything through the lens of their diagnosis. One quote from the study said, "Hey, I started wondering if every bad day meant I was relapsing. So I stopped trusting myself." So the diagnosis helped give structure, but also made people hyper aware of every shift in mood or thought. And this is where over-identification can happen when you're no longer me having a rough week, but me being broken again. Lastly, we need to talk about treatment expectations. This final domain explored how diagnosis shapes people's understanding of what treatment should look like and whether that matched reality. Some people felt very optimistic. As we've seen, there's positive and negatives. One person said, I thought, finally, I'll get the help I need. Someone said, I expected someone to have a plan now. But others were disillusioned and not so happy. One person quoted, all they did was throw meds at me and put me on a wait list. And someone else said, hey, I thought the diagnosis would lead me to real help, but it just felt like a dead end. According to the review, diagnosis altered expectations of care. For some, it promised solutions, while for others, it limited choice or raised unrealistic hope. In short, the label gave people expectations, but what the system delivered often fell short. And that mismatch, that's where the frustration and hopelessness can creep in. To sum it up, the authors noted that a label can legitimize distress, making someone feel like their distress is real, and help in accessing services. But it also brought new challenges. And this is backed up by other research. Another paper titled, Who Benefits from Diagnostic Labels for Developmental Disorders, examined how in neurodevelopmental conditions, labels can offer access to interventions and legitimize needs, but also can perpetuate stigma and reduce perceived capability. This article states, and I quote, diagnostic labels can empower by validating differences and opening access to support, but they also risk reinforcing deficit-based thinking when applied without nuance. This just means that there's a risk of being seen as only what they don't have or are not capable of doing. Their conclusion? Labels are instrumental in stigma formation, meaning they make the stigma, but also useful in countering in some contexts. And in another more recent empirical study, Helpful or Harmful: The Effect of a Diagnostic Label and Its Later Correction, found that even when a label is later corrected, the initial diagnosis can linger in others' impressions and reinforce harmful stereotypes. They show that people viewing marginal psychological symptoms judged them more harshly when a diagnosis was added, even if that label was later revised or removed. They were still judging based on that label. So labels can help you get seen and supported, but the journey doesn't always end there. So let's look at the risks and harms and lean into why many people push back and what the data says about those downsides. The first one is talking about psychological distress, identity locking, and moving into what's called that sick role. Again, we're quoting that scoping review, Consequences of a Diagnostic Label, which points out multiple negative outcomes that increase psychological distress, preference for more invasive treatments, sick role behavior where people feel they must behave as someone who is ill in order to be believed, and mostly that reduced autonomy and independence due to those labels. Another paper titled, Do Diagnostic Labels Affect How Symptoms of Mental Illness Are Perceived?, showed that adding labels to behaviors makes people see them as less common, less blameworthy, and less controllable, but also less likely to be normalized. In other words, the label can subtly shift how we see someone. Oh, this is a medical problem, which can reduce judgment, but also reduce the expectations of recovery or even how a person sees themselves playing the role in their life or that personal agency. Another relevant findings in an article quoted the relationship between mental illness and stigma and self-labeling. Research discussed how stigma can cut both ways. Self-labeling, i.e., deciding if I have a mental illness, can prompt self-seeking, but it also can make people more vulnerable to internalized stigma, anticipated discrimination, and negative identity impacts. And self-stigma is a big thing. When we think of self-stigma, this is the idea and the self-concept we have, and self-stigma can get in the way of doing things that we would normally try to do. When I talk about self-stigma in my presentations and the workshops that I facilitate, I always bring up the idea of me being athletic. For a long time, I categorize myself as not being very athletic, which means that I kind of limited myself in doing a lot of different things. Now I have kind of switched around my idea of myself and I have stopped thinking of myself as not athletic. And because of that, I've gotten into a lot of different things. I started running, I lift weights. I did one of those DECA competitions where they have the different kind of stations, and I did so well. I actually did the best time or one of the best times from our church. I did it in about like 16, 17 minutes. And I even beat my husband, and now it's on tape. And he probably hates that I said that, but I tell everybody that I beat him. And he was the one that I would consider the athletic one. So the idea of self-stigma is a big deal because we limit ourselves based on these ideas and labels that we've given ourselves. So let's imagine this. You receive a diagnosis. It gives you a roadmap, but at the same time, it can inflict and inflect how others see you. And sometimes more than that is how you see yourself. There's a shift in expectations, and it can amplify that stigma. But let's take a quick break. It's a good one, though. Because if you've been listening and thinking, wow, there's a lot going on here, and I wish I could feel, more grounded, less reactive, and actually bounce back when life is hard, I got something for you. And it's called Resilience X. This is my signature workshop where I teach you practical, science-based tools to build real-life resilience. And resilience is super important in the world today. We're talking about nervous system regulation, mindset shifts, emotional coping strategy, and it's all designed to help you stay steady when life gets messy. You can head to arizainspire.com to sign up. You can grab your workbook there and start showing up for yourself in a whole new way. The workshop starts up in January, so there's still time to hop on in. But let's get back to the episode. Now, there is another part of this idea and this hot take. The idea, if you're anxious or depressed, just exercise and eat better and all things will get better for you. But this idea being so widespread is only partially true. And again, it's all in the nuance of it. Science does support the idea that eating better and exercise helps. There's solid evidence that physical activity improves mood, reduces depressive symptoms, and benefits mental health broadly. A 2023 systematic review titled Effects of Exercise for Depression, Systematic Review and Network Meta-Analysis concluded that walking, jogging, yoga, and strength training are effective for depression. Another meta-analysis examined 25 randomized controlled trials, including participants with major depressive disorder, and found large, significant reductions in depressive symptoms from exercise versus the control group. Another resistance exercise trial called Effects of Resistance Exercise Training on Depressive Symptoms found an 8-week strength training program led to meaningful mood improvements compared to waitlist controls. Even more, a study from Efficacy of Exercise combined with standard treatment showed that combining exercise with standard treatments like therapy and medication yields better antidepressant effects than standard treatments alone. So yes, what everybody's been saying, lifestyle changes help. They shift your neurochemistry, they improve your brain plasticity, they reduce inflammation in your body, and elevate mood. But the way we say it is important because the word just is a dangerous word. The danger is when people oversell it, just exercise and diet, as though that cures everything, but that ignores the severity of some mental health illnesses, individuals' biological vulnerabilities and how their bodies work. It also doesn't take into account when symptoms block your capacity to exercise or eat well, because when you are in a serious depression, it can be very difficult to get the motivation to do that. We talked about motivation in another episode here. It also forgets the idea of multiple interventions working together, because research indicates that exercise, while powerful, is not enough alone for moderate to severe diagnosis. The resistance training trial mentioned above helped, but it didn't always fully resolve depression for everyone. Another meta-analysis, the analysis of exercise protocols, notes moderate effect sizes and the difficulty of defining optimal dose, intensity, and duration when it comes to exercise. So we can embrace exercise as a meaningful tool. There's nothing wrong with it, but it doesn't wipe away the needs for therapy or medications, different structural supports, or even deeper interventions. And there's the other part of this hot take, the idea that medication is just a crutch and people should learn to cope naturally. And this, I think, is the heaviest part of this because it echoes a romanticized idea of natural healing, self-sufficiency, and that needing medication is somehow weak. So let's pick it apart. Because there's a legitimate role of psychiatric medication. Because medication isn't necessarily a magic bullet, and I think sometimes people take it as that. If I take this medication, I'm going to be magically cured, but that's not necessarily how it works. Research shows it's often a necessary component, though, for many people. Many mood, anxiety, bipolar, and psychotic disorders have biological underpinnings. That whole neurotransmitter thing we've talked about, I think in episode 1 or 2, it really messes with that if you have an imbalance there. The idea of receptor sensitivity or different alterations in how your brain functions can play a major role in your mental health. And for some people, medication supports stabilize those things so that therapy and life changes can even be possible. In a meta analytic review on treatment preferences, this meta analysis titled Patient Preference for Psychological versus Pharmacological Treatment found that many patients prefer therapy over medication, but that preferences also vary. And importantly, many choose both simultaneously rather than one or the other. However, there is huge medication stigma, and it's a super powerful stigma, actually. In a study titled Stigma of Taking Psychiatric Medications Among Users, over half of respondents reported feeling judged or uncomfortable disclosing they take medication. About 1/5 felt embarrassed by it. Another study, Connection Between Self-Stigma, Adherence to Treatment, and Diagnostics Groups, went across 332 patients in varied diagnostic groups, which showed that higher self-stigma was correlated with lower adherence to medications. In other words, when people internalize negative views about needing medication, they're more likely to stop them unadvisedly, meaning they stop taking it. So the crutch narrative is very dangerous because it enforces shame, discourages adherence, and simplifies medication use to moral weakness instead of part of a holistic plan. Because there is very much nuance. Medications have side effects. They require monitoring and adjustment, and sometimes some trial and error to find the right medication for you. Not everyone needs medication, though. Some do fine with just therapy or lifestyle supports alone. And the best outcomes often come from combined treatment approaches like medication and therapy, and lifestyle, and structural support, meaning it's not just one. We should very much stop framing medication as a failure or surrender, instead, as a tool, a support, a way to stabilize so growth can happen. And that's one of the ways that I always talk with my clients about it. It's another tool in your toolbox. Sometimes you just need it for the moment in order to stabilize, in order to learn all those tools that you need to get to that destination or continue on this emotional, mental health wellness journey. So let's pull this all into a voice you can share with other people. Yes. Diagnosis can feel tight and constraining. And yes, labels can open doors to care, but also carry those tough identities. And yes, moving your body or eating better does help. But those are supports, not cures in isolation. And yes, medication can feel scary and foreign or shameful if framed as a crutch. But for many people, it is a roadmap through deep pain toward functionality, calm, and connection. Our goal is not to live inside labels, but to use them wisely as tools, not as prisons and boxes. To recognize that diagnosis is not identity and that healing is messy, person-specific, and often requires multiple paths. But that's it for today's episode. Thanks for hanging out with me. If you found something helpful or inspiring or even just validating, I'd love if you'd follow the show, leave a review, share this episode with someone who might need it, And if you want more tools to support your mental wellness journey, head over to arizainspire.com. You'll find free resources, courses to help you on your own time, and workbooks to help you heal, grow, and show up for yourself. And don't forget to follow along on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, at Ariza Inspire. And that's where we keep the conversation going. We share mental health tips, we post about the new episodes, and I might be a little embarrassing on there, so if you need a laugh, you can go there. But at the end of the day, my friends, take care of yourself, and I'll catch you next time. Can't wait for next week? Here's a sneak peek of the next episode on the Ariza Inspire Podcast. The whole idea of the mental health industry profits from keeping people sick is a doozy, right? It's a heavy one. But here's the thing. It's a critique I think we need to talk about.